Hello everybody and welcome back to Dog Without Horse. Today, ahead of the Halloween season, we are going to be talking about something that I feel needs repeating, especially right now, and that is cultural appropriation, but especially in fandom. So here's our roadmap. We are going to be talking about definitions, mainly because I feel like it is very important to actually define what this is when it comes to fandom, as well as what it is when we actually sit down and talk about it, because I think that it has a lot of information about the power dynamics that are involved in cultural appropriation and in the after effects of cultural appropriation and the effect that it has on marginalized people who are affected by cultural appropriation. We are also going to be talking about why it's important to know it when you see it, in regard to the after effect of cultural appropriation, that it is not just a singular action, it factors into the systemic and institutional oppression of multiple marginalized groups, and that even if it's a whoopsie, I did a racism, it's still factoring into a larger system of oppression. We are also going to talk about specifically how it applies to fandom, how it applies to the things that people in fandom enjoy, and how that affects other people in fandom when you engage in that cultural appropriation. And then, as always, hot takes, then wrap up, and final thoughts. So definitions. Cultural appropriation is technically defined by Oxford as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs and practices, ideas, etc. of one people or society by members of another, typically more dominant people or society. And the reason why I felt that that was important to start off with is because within that definition, the phrase of typically more dominant suggests that this act accompanies an existing power dynamic between two or more groups. The phrase unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption also suggests that this action is usually done in bad faith and meant to position the group having their, quote, customs and practices or ideas being adopted in a less favorable and therefore more negative light, meaning that the co-opting of customs, practices, or ideas is done purposefully with the intent to defame or dehumanize the group in question. Cultural appropriation can also be identified in a more colloquial sense. Colloquial meaning used in a characteristic of familiar and informal conversation. So more accessible, maybe not as academic, but more casual, that you would bring up in conversation. Through examples which are including but not limited to non-native women in war bonnets or buckskin dresses, Adam Rappaport of Bon Appetit and his wife in brownface, non-Asian women elongating their eyes with makeup and positioning their hands at the corners to mimic double-lidded eyes, which was a very troubling trend that we saw over the summer, and any non-black person with cornrows or dreadlocks attempting to look, quote, urban. So, in the scope of the United States, I wanted to include the reason why some of these non-academic examples constitute cultural appropriation, just from the frame of reference of the United States, because that's where I'm from, that's where I live. The United States is a society that operates on systems and institutions created by and for white people of European descent. This fulfills the burden of the definition of dominant people or society. Therefore, this makes non-white European ethnic or racial groups in the U.S. less, quote, dominant, and therefore inappropriate or unacknowledged adoption of these groups' customs and practices or ideas positions them beneath people of white European descent, both socially and culturally. This is almost always done without the consent of cultural stewards, usually in a way that makes use of stereotypes of that group in order to degrade them, because they have separated the body from that person's culture, which is meant to remove the idea that these who are members of these cultures are human beings. So why is it important that we know what this is when we see it? Hundreds upon hundreds of people have covered what cultural appropriation is and the fact that it's wrong, so at this point in 2021, it feels kind of like a moot point to say anything more because they're right. However, I want to offer more structural support and context for why the act of cultural appropriation is both purposeful and harmful. Red Hair Crow is a Chiricahua, Apache, Cherokee, and African American educator with a master's in Native American Studies and a bachelor's of science in psychology. Haircrow presents cultural appropriation as the 7th part of an 11th-part cycle that constitutes the procession of a genocide under the classification of, quote, attacks on identity, seen here, alongside stereotyping and dehumanization. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust also published a similar graphic on the process of genocide based on research by Dr. Gregory H. Stanton titled The 10 Stages of Genocide, with dehumanization as stage 4. This is detailed as, quote, those perceived as different are treated with no form of human rights or personal dignity. During the genocide in Rwanda, Tutsis were referred to as, quote, cockroaches. The Nazis referred to Jews as, quote, vermin. Even though these are a little different in their exact verbiage, they still present the same information. Cultural appropriation fits into a cycle of genocide on a cultural level, acting as both a removal of dignity, agency, and the responsibility of the society they live in to respect their civil and human rights. It's worth noting, however, that not everyone who engages in cultural appropriation is doing so with the intent to cause or contribute to the genocide of a people, because if you genuinely did something with no prior knowledge on how it harms people, then what you did was a true accident. But it's also worth noting that cultural appropriation undoubtedly does factor into systemic violence that constitutes genocide. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in the same infographic states, genocide never just happens. There is always a set of circumstances which occur or are created to build the climate in which a genocide can take place. What this communicates to me is that these actions are completely avoidable as long as you think before you act. Examples of this include, but are not limited to, the first thing that I thought of was people who are born in the state of Hawaii but are not indigenous Hawaiians saying they are, quote, native Hawaiians. Technically, yes, you are native to that state because you were born there, so you aren't inherently doing something harmful. But when we use the term native in this way, especially on land housing a kingdom that was attacked by the U.S., a settler colonial state, it is as though indigenous Hawaiians don't exist anymore, and to call oneself a native Hawaiian as an indigenous person no longer has meaning. So while this usage of the word is not inherently meant to separate indigenous people from our culture and our ancestral land, it still does that, regardless of the motivation behind using it in this way. Aside from obvious critique about racism, xenophobia, and colorism in the larger atmosphere of fandom, I also want to zero in on the cultural appropriation in things like artwork and source material. I'll point to some concrete example in popular media. An artist on Twitter was trending for having drawn Katara from Avatar: The Last Airbender as an Inuk woman with facial tattoos, while the artist themselves is not Inuk. The reason why many people, specifically Inuit, felt that this was culturally appropriative is that the Inuit body tattoos each have their own specific meaning in their placement, their shape, and in their application. And according to CNN, when missionaries arrived in Canada's Arctic about 100 years ago, as of 2019, when the article was published, they proclaimed the tattoos evil and banned women from getting them. The markings were on the brink of dying with the last elders who had them. As of 2021, this practice is still outlawed in Canada, when it had originally taken place in all of Canada, Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and Greenland. These body tattoos for Inuit women are culturally tied to Inuit traditional religion and spiritual belief systems, and act as a physical connection to the origin of their culture. For non-Inuit to utilize these markings in their artwork, although the action is in good faith, still constitutes cultural appropriation, because non-Indigenous people will never be punished for having traditional markings on their bodies. Indigenous people will be, because that ban was specifically designed to punish them on an institutional level. One example that I also thought prudent to bring up was actually within the Atlas series, Season 1, Episode 17, The Northern Air Temple. Earth Kingdom citizens have taken refuge in the Northern Air Temple after a flood destroyed their village, and a boy named Teo's father has begun destroying parts of the temple and building on top of it in order to retrofit the temple to their needs. This episode brings up a lot of really weird issues, predominantly ableism and industrialization as a form of settler colonialism. The Mechanist, who is Teo's father, tells Aang that he used gliders painted in the temple in order to make a mobility aid for his son Teo because it would, quote, put him on equal ground with everyone else, and that his work improves on what already existed, to which Aang replies, quote, nature knows when to stop. After seeing Katara fly with a glider, Aang ultimately changes his mind and opens the innermost sanctuary of the temple. I have a huge problem with invoking the story of displaced refugees and physically disabled people in order to make appropriation and settler colonialism acceptable. It positions the refugee population and disabled people complicit in this instance of settling on sacred land and structures that tie a person to their culture. Ultimately, the takeaway from this episode is not that Aang is preserving the nomadic culture of the Air Nation by allowing these refugees to seek safety in the Northern Temple, but that the commodification of his culture is a means to an end. And as long as someone in need benefits from it, it's acceptable. It makes Aang's reaction to the destruction of the last remaining tangible pieces of his home and culture both selfish and unreasonable. And I can't accept the stakes of that narrative as an indigenous person whose people's culture is considerably effective extinct by anthropology. What troubles me is that criticism of this episode and this narrative is met with extreme pushback, and it looks less like academic discussion and more like people whining about cancel culture. Not into it. Because within this episode, you are making people who were forcibly displaced complicit in the violence of settler colonialism and putting them on the same ground as people who are doing settler colonialism. And it simply isn't so. You would not consider people who are forcibly brought from one country to another to be settlers or doing settler colonialism because it was done against their will. But then at the same time, what this episode does is that it recreates the idea that refugees are destructive and that to bring a refugee population into another country will inherently tear down some semblance of that country. And it simply isn't so. You cannot put refugee populations that are forcibly displaced through one reason or another on the same social dynamic footing as people who are actively engaging in settler colonialism like the Fire Nation. It simply doesn't track because not only are the motivations different, but also a refugee population does not seek to destroy, whereas the Fire Nation does, and that engaging with the destruction of the Northern Air Temple as some sort of common ground that the refugees have with the Fire Nation, and that Aang simply needs to understand that the destruction needs to take place, it just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, moving on to costuming in WandaVision. That's fun. The character Wanda Maximoff is based off of the Marvel heroine the Scarlet Witch, who was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in 1964 in The X-Men #4. The character was originally named Wanda Maximoff and is a Romani woman. Her powers stem from the Maximoff family bloodline and their talent in using magic, which has its own issues of representation and whitewashing to be criticized, but we'll leave that for another day. Wanda's first appearance in the MCU is by Elizabeth Olsen, a white woman. Her latest solo IP is the central figure of Disney's WandaVision, in which Olsen stated, "We have a Halloween episode and they were trying to figure out how big of a nod to the character we were going to do. And it did start off with the classic Scarlet Witch costume. It was kind of like a thing that has to wear a headband, and I fought for it. I was like, no, we have to go full into it. This is the greatest thing. If Paul's doing it, I'm doing it." I'm really in the costume for quite a bit, and it was so fun. I loved it, and it was the perfect way to wear that costume because you can't take it seriously. If anybody involved in production would have done a cursory Google search, they would have found that Romani people's headwear looks nothing like the Scarlet Witch's headband. Romani cultural headwear or hair coverings have a deep cultural significance and are not this quirky costume accessory. Also, the word that Olsen uses to describe Romani people is in fact a slur. And that's not just me saying that, that is from people within the Romani community have openly stated multiple times that is a slur. Wanda's headband really has no similarity to Romani headwear or hair coverings. It's kind of just a pointy crown to liken her headband to an actual cultural item just because the character is Romani and you have a skewed idea of who Romani people are as a culture just doesn't make any sense. It's appropriative, plain and simple. And then for Elizabeth Olsen to say, quote, "You can't take the costume seriously," right after that simply smacks of anti-Romani racism. And as I have established, even if she didn't intend it in what she said or what she's doing, that is what it is. Essentially, she is viewing playing Wanda Maximoff as literally putting on and taking off the costume of a living, breathing Romani person, which is an extremely troubling mental image, to say the least. Even if, whoopsie, you did a racism. Because you were ill-informed or ignorant, the action still factors into preserving a larger environment and structure under which Romani people are still marginalized and actively being disenfranchised. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that Elizabeth Olsen or that the artist that I mentioned earlier or the creators of Atla are racist. What I am saying is that the attitude with which you include marginalized people matters, in the context that if you're doing it with the intent to capitalize off of representations of marginalized people, without really taking the time to think about how that action affects the real people who are discriminated against for taking part in their own culture, you are doing something in bad faith and, whether it was purposefully or not, with ill intent. We should also be critically consuming the narratives that are making up what we're watching. While flaws don't make the totality of a work bad, they need to be acknowledged that at the very least, and not just tucked under the bed to be dealt with later when we decide that we don't like it anymore. Like, just because we love Wanda doesn't mean we can't criticize her presentation to the audience or the comments made about her character by the woman who plays her. Think about this comic by Megan Nicole Dong as part of her book, Sketch Shark. A toad talks to a cat and says, "There are so many stories about cats and so few tales of toads. I would love to share more toad stories with the world." The cat replies, "My God, you are right. There should be more stories about your kind." However, the cat then says, "I will tell these stories about your kind." In the space beneath the first 4 panels, the toad reacts to the cat having painted themselves green and wearing a hat with little eyeballs to make themselves look like a toad. The cat is going into that performance with its own perspective on toads and their lives and their cultures without even consulting the toad or really caring how this affects the toad at all. It literally encapsulates the whole point of what I'm trying to say in 5 perfect panels. Megan, I love you. So now we're going to get into my favorite segment, hot takes. Of course, the first one is, quote, "This is appreciation, not appropriation." Technically, yes, but realistically, no. The difference between appreciation and appropriation is when the people whose cultural elements are being utilized have some autonomy and some agency in how that utilization takes place. For example, people opening restaurants to share their cultural food want you to eat there. Indigenous people making beaded jewelry, unless otherwise stated, want you to support their artwork by buying it. That is appreciation, supporting marginalized people directly. But I asked and they said it was okay. That autonomy and agency from before also includes you not putting please and thank you tokens into people of color, expecting cultural usage licenses to fall out of us. Our cultures have points of access that we guard because of the systemic and institutional oppression that essentially made their practice illegal when we took part in them. It was perfectly fine for other people, usually white people in the scope of the United States, to make fun of us by using exaggerated bastardizations of our cultural trappings, but not for us to engage with our own cultures. It was literally a crime. For example, powwow dancing is a huge part of indigenous culture in North America. However, because Catholic and Christian missionaries saw our dances as, quote, evil and heathenish, they convinced the US government to outlaw it in 1883. Though many still held powwows and danced in secret, it would not be made explicitly legal until 1978. That is 90 years worth of culture that was made punishable by law. Because the practice of culture is key to the preservation of our cultural identity, it essentially made us, as people, illegal. What about people outside of the internet? They don't care about this. You need to stop attacking people for internet clout. In some cases, I get that. A lot of people do tend to be reactionary when they want to say something is appropriative in order to substitute ongoing, deliberate social justice work. Personally, I think this is the result of when a revolution against the status quo is inherently seen as violent and efforts are made by the establishment to defang their opposition through propaganda like historical revisionism, which then leads people to believe that just being mad enough is enough to get something done about a problem. But that's for another time. However, this is a problem with the way that people go about activism as a whole by treating it as a contest to see who can get the most notoriety on social media and claim the title of most woke. This is an issue with the commodification and historical revision of social justice movements, not just with combating cultural appropriation, racism, or xenophobia. What you do when you engage in this line of logic is called whataboutism. And of course you may be asking, what about whataboutism? Well, whataboutism is defined by Oxford as, quote, the technique or practice of responding to an accusation of difficult question by making a counter-accusation or raising a different issue. As much as you can rightly say that a lot of people do go overboard with their critique, you really need to be mindful of when and how you bring that up and the core of the issue that people are getting upset over. So where have we been today? Let's take a look. Cultural appropriation is when you take the trappings of another culture and adopt them as your own when you are not a part of that culture, as a person with more social power over that culture. And of course, as I stated before, in different cultural contexts, such as in Canada or the US or Mexico, cultural appropriation will look different in each of those countries, strictly because they have different social atmospheres, different political atmospheres, and different power dynamics with the people who live in those countries. Cultural appropriation exists within a cycle of violence that doesn't need to take place. If you just do a cursory Google search and think before you do something, you can probably avoid doing it. Within production spaces, people in charge really need to look to authoritative sources before they make things like costuming choices and setting up certain storylines. Within fandom spaces, content creators, artists need to be mindful of what they're doing and when they're doing it, and when they decide to use other cultures as, quote, inspiration, because even if it is well-intentioned, it can still be harmful. Your hot takes are ice cold. Read a book, maybe. I would suggest Ijoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, or Vindeloria Jr.'s Custardized for Your Sins and Indian Manifesto. Final thoughts. Cultural appropriation is bad because it perpetuates an ongoing cycle of violence. Just don't do it. That's that on that. So with all of that being said, if you're still looking for a Halloween costume, don't do a racist one. That's pretty much it. I especially wanted to talk about this ahead of Halloween because I know that a lot of companies, especially like Spirit Halloween, are still selling culturally appropriative costumes, such as, quote, the Indian princess, which, as we all know, hopefully, perpetuates an ongoing cycle of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. But again, already went over that. But yeah, that is the end of this video. Stay tuned for my Halloween video. I have something very exciting planned, and it is a genre deep dive into one of my favorite horror film subgenres. Yes, alright, bye!